is loading up, and we are good to go.
Hello and welcome. This is the RPGs Beyond D&D workshop, brought to you virtually in this time of virtual meetings. This workshop will be very cursory. We're going to go in depth more at a later time, but we're still going to try and cover like 6 genres and 20-something games if we can. This is being brought to you by 2 organizations, the Cincinnati Adventurers Guild and Superheroines, etc. I'm the organizer for the Cincinnati Adventurers Guild. We do local games in game shops, and we are doing everything gaming, role-playing, miniatures, card games, board games. And we also want to foster a sense of community, so we do other things like movie premieres, parties, trivia nights. The goal is to kind of bring the community together here in Cincinnati and have one local place that everybody can check. We also help people with finding games, and we help GMs find players. We're excited to bring you this workshop and wish we had more time because we have so many more games that we could be covering. Whitney?
Hi, I'm Whitney. I am with Superheroines, etc. Superheroines, etc. is a nonprofit here in Cincinnati that works to create a safe and inclusive space for everyone in the geek and nerd communities. Our definition of geek and nerd is very vast. It's basically anything that kind of gets your nerdy and geeky heart going. So we have events that run from RPGs and your more traditional geek events like that, to board games, to Marvel events, to trivia, to crafting events. So we're just kind of across the board. Anything that is really considered a geek community, we're a part of.
Thank you. There is a supplementary document that we have posted on both the Meetup and the Facebook event. It's 2 pages. It gives you definitions of some tags we're going to be hanging on some RPGs, and will help you kind of follow along as to what we're talking about in the differences between the games we're covering. You'll also find a list of the games we're going to be covering or try to cover today, and that way you can reference that in case you have questions later. We're not going to have much time for questions because we've only got 2.5 hours, but I have more than enough time after this workshop to talk RPGs for several hours. So I am absolutely open to talking more after this is done. We will be going fast. We're going to try and cover each genre in about 20 to 25 minutes. And unfortunately, we're not going to have the ability to get every game that everyone wants to hear about. We just kind of tried to pick a selection across the board to give you a kind of a sampling of things beyond D&D. We have 6 genres: fantasy, sci-fi, horror, historical, superhero, and dystopian. And we pick between 2 and 5 games in each of those categories. We're going to start with alternate fantasy games, and Whitney is going to start us off by talking about Pathfinder.
Oh, so kind of on the list of the games that we're going to talk about today, I'm going to be honest, Pathfinder is the most similar game on this list to D&D. And amusingly enough, Pathfinder was actually created based off of D&D's open source system. And it was kind of created by Paizo to be a streamlined rule set for D&D 3.5 edition. as Pathfinder has progressed, its rule system and characters and magic system and things like that has diverted and has made itself a little bit more unique from D&D as the editions have come out. But Pathfinder did start off as, I don't want to say like a supplemental, but it was built as an addition to an extension of D&D. And Pathfinder First Edition is in the community usually referred to as D&D 3.75, just because it really streamlined a lot of the rules and a lot of issues that people had with D&D 3.5 edition. So when you're in the Pathfinder system in fantasy, your world, your rule set, your characters, your magic, your spells, a lot of it is going to feel very D&D like. If you are playing Pathfinder First Edition, there's a reason for that. A lot of the spells are exactly or very, very similar to the 3.5 edition D&D. So there's a lot of that you'll see. But Pathfinder 2nd Edition came out, I think about 2 years ago, and it's starting to kind of make itself its own unique place in the world now. So it's a lot of fun, but your combat systems, your combat centric, your world building, your character sheet building, your rule systems are really going to be very D&D like. I play more Pathfinder than D&D. I like Pathfinder more. I think it's more straightforward, and I like the customization of it more. But they are so very similar, and my gaming group can actually jump between the two pretty easily and pretty quickly, rule set wise. I didn't want to go too much into Pathfinder because it's so similar to D&D.
There was one question in the chat.
Okay. Not really. So the question is Pathfinder 2.0 considered D&D 5.25 then? As I said, Pathfinder 2.0 edition has really started to kind of make its own niche in the world, and it really has started to kind of build itself as its own unique game. I haven't played Pathfinder 2.0 very much. I did the play test, but that was about it. And I've only done the 5th ed play test, and they were, yes, the world, like your characters, your archetypes, your classes and things like that were pretty similar, but how you actually built things, how you could customize it, they were different enough that I don't myself consider Pathfinder 2.0 as an extension of D&D anymore. I do consider them, and I feel like they are two unique games now. The next game up, and I'm just going to hand it off, is Jason talking about Dungeon Crawl Classics.
Dungeon Crawl Classics is what is referred to as an old school Renaissance or OSR game. These are games that harken back to games of the 70s and early 80s, the original AD&D, D&D feel. Dungeon Crawl Classics is moderately popular. You can sometimes find it, especially in the Cincinnati area. There are several enthusiastic play groups and that have contributed things like writing modules and such and so forth locally. So there is a culture out there that does play Dungeon Crawl Classics. Dungeon Crawl Classics is very much classical fantasy. Magic, warriors, overwhelming monsters, a little bit of problem solving in the games I've played, but the principal way you're probably going to encounter it is the funnel. The funnel is where you play 4 different characters, and you have the opportunity to play all 4 of them at the same time. going through what is basically a meat grinder. And as you go through, certain characters will die off and certain ones will survive, and whichever ones survive end up becoming your character in the game. And they're by no means perfect, but they are customized. And you can end up with things like, I went through the cavern out of time with my thing of cheese dip, and I was successful. Basically because I went in the back and never touched anything that I didn't know what it was. Dungeon Crawl Classics has a vast array of modules out there. And they are very, very traditional, old school modules. A lot of dungeon crawling, a lot of exploration. The setting is fairly generic. So it can be applied and dropped into different worlds. So if you've got your own custom world and you want to drop in a Dungeon Crawl Classics module, you can do that fairly easily. It isn't tied to any one big setting. I've not played Dungeon Crawl Classics too extensively, but I did want to bring it up as an alternative to D&D. And I don't have it does use an interesting die system where if you have advantages, it will increase the size of your dice. So it has funky things like D13s and D15s. And if you're rolling a D12 and things are going well for you, you may get to roll a D14 instead. If things are going bad for you, you may get to roll a D9. There are things like that that help you modify the difficulty. As I remember it, magic was very dangerous, so be warned. It is not your traditional fantasy magic where you just cast the spell and things go off as planned. Same thing with combat. Combat has a lot of interesting variations that make it unique and interesting. Examples would be critical hits, where you cut off limbs or stab them in vital parts. Just things that are a little more detailed and lead the GM down a little bit more focused path. That's really all I have for Dungeon Crawl Classics. There are other OSR games we couldn't fit in. A lot of them are pretty good at emulating that sort of genre, but we didn't have a lot of time to cover all of them. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Amanda, and you can talk about 7th Sea.
Yes. So, 7th Sea. Ooh. 7th Sea is, I've heard it described as Princess Bride, the game. It has nothing actually to do with Princess Bride, but if you think of like the over-the-top, heroic, swashbuckling pirate kind of, I know there's not really too many. Anyway, 7th Sea is a game that definitely rewards heroics, and it's got a bunch of lore that you could dive into and beautiful, beautiful artwork, which attracted me to it for sure. I've been playing in a game for about a year now with my group, and we definitely are trying to drag it out so it doesn't end. It's kind of like the setting would be fantasy Europe, if that makes sense. Like there are definite like parallels between like, oh, that's definitely the Britain of this universe, or that's definitely Spain. It does make for a lot of embarrassing accents that players try to affect during the game. If you have a group that is, theatrical enough. They work on a D10 system. D10s, show and tell. And the interesting thing about this game that I've found different than other games I've played is that it works on this concept of raises. And so you're basically adding up the total number, like you build your dice pool based on, what stats you have, and you add up the total number of your roll, and every set of 10, you get a raise. And there are other things that change that, but that's the basic rule. And rather than just automatic success or failure, you get to discuss with your GM and be like, okay, well, I want to do this really cool, awesome, crazy stunt, and I have 7 raises. So I'm going to use all 7 raises on this turn and just do something outrageously cool. And the GM can, barter with you or be like, oh, okay, like, sure, that would work. Or maybe not because of this, this, or this. Or they can tempt you with something called hero points, which is like even extra finesse and fanciness that you could throw in there. But then you can't act for a few rounds if you use up like everything at once. And so you could just say like, okay, well, I'm going to use 2 of my 7 raises right now to do this, and then next time I'm going to try this sort of thing. So it's a little bit more loose than like a super turn initiative based system, which I thought was kind of cool. It works for a more organic storytelling kind of a feel, and I've really been enjoying it. And I don't think that I will go too much into I could really go into the story. I mean, like many games, you could either focus on like the historical events that have happened in the game and build stuff related to the main like figures in that, or you can go completely your own way and ignore all of it and just kind of use the setting as you would make a sequel to Princess Bride or something like that. But yes, it's like I said, it rewards heroics and fancy stunts and creativity, and I think that's really interesting because it's really on the players just as much as the GM to collaboratively create the story. So I think I'll cut it there and go back to Jason with Dungeon World.
All right. One other thing I want to say about 7th Sea that Amanda touched on, it is both a fictional setting and a known setting. The known setting is you will find very obvious parallels to medieval and Renaissance Europe. The fictional setting is there are some interesting differences in there that, there's magic there. And so, but it's different types of magic depending on the region you're coming from. And sometimes it's having, poultices and herbs, and other times it's using blood to create portals or using the strands of fate to alter things. I wish I could play more 7th Sea. I've played 1 and really enjoyed it. It's one of the reasons we wanted to include it on the list because it's different enough from D&D that, we felt it deserved a mention along with some other ones. Dungeon World. Dungeon World is one of my favorite games. And it is one of the many games on this list that is powered by the apocalypse. What that means is Powered by the Apocalypse uses a very simple, very flexible dice system in that you roll 2d6, you maybe add a modifier, 1 or 2, and the general result is 10 or better, you do it, and there's little complications, whatever you're trying to do. From a 7 to 9, you do it, but there are consequences or complications. At 6 or less, you fail, the GM gets to do something, but you always fail forward, so you mark experience. And that's going to come up again and again and again in a lot of the games we go over, because especially in horror and some of the dystopian ones, and some other ones that we didn't have enough time to kind of go over in depth. But Dungeon World is very much, again, a classic setting. It's not set into any one world. It doesn't have anything like modules. It just basically has the basic book. And instead of having character classes, it has what they call playbooks. So you select a playbook that you're going to play. For example, the fighter, or the wizard, or the thief. And they have certain special things they can do based on when the fiction comes up. Dungeon World is a fiction-first game. You can't say, I want to roll to do an investigation check. What you have to do is you actually say, my character is going to look around the room checking underneath the bed. Then the GM will say, okay, that sounds like you're doing an investigation check. Go ahead and roll for discern realities or something like that. It has a very, very short list of moves. It is very easy to pick up and play. It is very easy to do a one-shot. It is very easy to adapt other systems and other settings and modules into Dungeon World because there's not a lot of mechanics going on it. Because it's so flexible and it has that move system and that 10 plus, 7 to 9, 6 or lower that is universal, it's very easy to play. As long as you know that basic system of 6 or lower, 7 to 9, 10 or better, you can just about play with just knowing that. And that's one of the reasons I really like it. It's very, very accessible to anybody that wants to pick it up and play. It's also fairly inexpensive. You can pick up the PDF for $10, and you can pick up the PDF and the physical book for $20 on certain sites. It's a greatly written, I love the way the book is written, especially the GM advice section. But I don't want to go too much in depth with it because we're running out of time for fantasy. So I'm going to pass it back to Whitney with Mouse Guard.
All right. So Mouse Guard system is based on the comic book Mouse Guard. I can't even see what I'm showing on the screen. There we go. So this is the RPG book. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the comic, but they look like this, and they're gorgeous. So the Mouse Guard world is you are kind of like a pseudo-medieval feudal time period where mice are sentient anthropomorphic for that word. And the Mouse Guard protects all of mouse kind. And they go out into the wilderness and they scout and they patrol and they protect all mice from the different creatures that are going to try and take over, that are trying to eat them, things like that. So you see a lot of their foes being like snakes and owls and things like that. As a matter of fact, this is the character Vanguard fighting a snake on the cover of the RPG book. So the world of Mouse Guard has been really kind of built out by the comic system, and things like the seasons and the territory that you're in and the location is a really big factor, because as you know, mice have a hard time getting through snow. They can't get through that as easily. Something as a little bit of just like a little trickle of water is a much bigger deal. So when you're playing the RPG, things like weather conditions and where you are in terrain play a much bigger role in this game than they do in a lot of other games. And the RPG system is based on the gaming system Burning Wheel, but it is a very scaled back version of the Burning Wheel system. So it's kind of referred to as Burning Wheel Light. So it is a D6 system. There are custom dice, but you can roll them as a D6, and there's a gauge between like what numbers equal what of those successes and failures. But it's very much story driven in the sense of you have something called hold on. Sorry, I just saw chats coming in. So you have things like instincts, you have skills that are kind of more of like your traditional skills that you would see. So you would see like fighter, hunter, scout, healer. But being able to roll for something to see if you can do something is more about the player explaining how having, let's say, scout 2 would, like 2 ranks in the scout ability, how I was raised as a scout by a scout master to be able to specifically track fox through snow to be able to avoid them. And then that is how I can build my role to see if I can track this this fox. Same thing with like if you have mechanics and you need to be able to build a raft, which is what happened in the last game that I played, explaining how I was raised in the city to be able to build lifts and elevators and things like that. I would have the innate ability to find material that would float and be able to bind them together to be able to get us across this river. And then I was able to build my dice pool based on that and then roll. So if you're not as familiar with the Mouse Guard world from the comic books, you don't really need to be. It's still pretty open and story driven. But there is a little bit of like locations and settings and things like that are kind of built in from the books, but it is open to build like your own cities and things like that. So that's it for Mouse Guard, and that kind of brings an end to our fantasy genre cover. So our next genre that we wanted to talk about was sci-fi, and Jason's first on that with Starfinder.
Yes, Starfinder is a pretty popular takeoff on Pathfinder. It takes everything that Pathfinder has and adds space. And you have space wizards, and you have space elves, and space elementals. You have everything that's contained in Pathfinder, in addition to all these alien races, things like skitters, which are basically Stitch from Lilo and Stitch. And it's very, very open, but it's very popular as well, especially in the Cincinnati area. Both the Pathfinder Society and the Starfinder Society are very, very active. And it's one reason I listed it as sci-fi and fantasy, is because you can do all the fantasy races. You can have elves and dwarves that are just warriors and rogues and wizards, in addition to things like having space wizards that have glowing swords that fight other people in one-on-one combat, or engineers that get together and there's a very detailed system for starship combat. I've played a little bit of Starfinder, not too much, but because it is so popular, I did want to make sure it gets a mention under science fiction. The books are averagely expensive, and there are things that you will find in Starfinder that were then used in Pathfinder 2nd edition, from what I understand. And it's kind of an evolving system, and they have a decent number of supplements out for it. So like Pathfinder, you can basically build whatever you want and customize it to an extreme degree. That's a lot of what I have to say about Starfinder. Let me check and see if there are any questions. Next up is Star Wars in all its various incarnations. There have been about 4. So Amanda's going to talk to us about some of those and any of her favorites.
Yes. Well, I'm going to talk about one of them because I've only played one, which is the Fantasy Flight. I don't have to tell you what Star Wars is, luckily, but I will say that Fantasy Flight, I'm not sure about the other ones, but Fantasy Flight at least is very much based Like the system is similar to if you've ever played the video game Knights of the Old Republic. Just the way the leveling and stats work in that, they're very, very similar. The dice are very interesting, and actually a lot of the players in my group were kind of put off by them at first. I will try to hold them up for you to see because they're all different symbols, and you kind of have to learn this whole new way of looking at your rolls and understanding what it says or what it means. And I sense a theme in some of my favorite games here, but what I love about how these roles work is it's very narrative. Like it's, again, not just like a yes or no, succeed or fail. Depending on what you roll, because there are positive and negative dice to every roll. And you could succeed at something, but roll enough negative things that they are horrible consequences that happened, even though you succeeded in whatever action you're trying to do. So it's like, all right, you successfully leapt across this entire thing, slashed your lightsaber, and knocked this guy out, but you also have pierced a hole in the hull, and now there's a problem because the vacuum of space is now an issue. So stuff like that, where you kind of take turns going back and forth with your GM, like, okay, well, you succeeded and you like rolled so well. Tell me what, or tell me how you're doing this or what you're doing. And the GM will be like, okay, but also here's what's happening on the negative side of things. Obviously, you have a huge range of options of characters and races, and like, you know, an extensive timeline if you want to go canon or not canon, or, you know, anything your imagination can handle, basically. When we played, I actually did a force-sensitive Gand, so that was a lot of fun. And there was just... somehow I became the most charismatic of the party, being, you know, basically a giant bug with a respirator thing. And so there's a lot of just opportunity for cool story arcs and just interesting stuff. And I'm looking at the chat. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I was kind of responding for you.
Yep. Yes. So that's kind of all I have to say on that. Yes, go ahead.
As I said in the chat, I also play the Fantasy Flight Star Wars, but my very first RPG that I ever played was the D20 Star Wars game, which was when Wizards of the Coast had the license. And it's really funny, but the D20 Star Wars, that was the Star Wars RPG game for many, many years. All of like the 2000s, I think, from like late 90s to what, like 20... Fantasy Flight only got the license when Disney bought Star Wars. So that's how recent that this game has come out. But the D20 version of Star Wars literally is D&D Star Wars. So it's Star Wars universe, it's Star Wars stories in space, but because it was by Wizards of the Coast, your character sheets look very similar, your combat looks very similar, it's still pretty combat heavy. But yeah, so the generation of Star Wars games before that was very much D&D Star Wars, but it's still a very beloved system. And there's lots of books and lots of things that you can do. And that's kind of my favorite system because it was my first.
That's awesome. If anyone else, any of the other hosts have experience with the other Star Wars systems and want to chime in at this point.
I have also played the FFG version a little bit. I've not GM'd it, but I've played it half a dozen times or so. It is very cinematic. It's not very crunchy. And the nice thing is you have the entire expanded universe to draw on. So if you're not into world building, if you find it a little overwhelming, but you've grown up with Star Wars like I have, and you know everything that happened in Star Wars, all the expanded universe, what you read the Marvel comics, you followed the Dark Horse stuff, you played the video games, you can take all of that and mush it into your campaign. Now, my biggest experience with Star Wars is the first edition that came out, Star Wars D6 from West End Games. Very well supported, very cinematic, very simple system where you just pick up a handful of dice and total them, and they're all D6s. So if you just take them and go groups of 10, and there's a lot of standard difficulties, like a very easy task is 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, and on up. Combat is not very realistic with hit points. You just kind of get stunned and then wounded, wounded again, and then you die. It's not very forgiving. But it encourages you to do things like make funny noises as you're playing. So you got to make the droid noises, and you have to make the laser phaser sounds as you're playing. The other thing it does is it talks about scale. Never blow up a city when you can blow up a planet. There are never millions of people's lives at stake. There are always billions. Don't have a massive fleet battle of 1,000 ships. Have it be 100,000 ships going into conflict with one another over a planet. Star Wars D6, from what I understand, is publicly available. So you can, if you can find it, you can download everything that West End Games ever published for it. The other thing is there has been a fan version called Revised, Expanded, and Updated, and it's also known as Re-Up. And that takes everything from D6, codifies it, brings it together, and makes one consistent rule system for Star Wars D6 that you can then turn around and use. It includes Clone Wars, it includes A New Hope, it includes stuff from the comic books. Just everything is included in Star Wars D6, just like some of the other Star Wars genres. Anybody else have anything with Star Wars?
No, that was about it. I know that my group is massive Star Wars fans, which is why we always have at least one Star Wars game going for the last 10 years I've been with the group, but they've been together for 20 years, and they started off with the D6 system, and that was always one of their favorite systems, and half of their epic stories of, oh my gosh, do you remember that one time? It was always the Star Wars D6 system. That's all I have. Just epicness.
I'm going to agree with what Whitney said.
All right, Jason, hey, it's your turn again.
Okay. One of the reasons I'm talking so often is because I have the broadest experience with a lot of these games. Some I have not played extensively. Some I have played extremely extensively for years and years, or have read lore for decades. Traveler is another old school Renaissance game. It is more or less the only science fiction game that was out there when the original edition of D&D came into being. There were some other ones like Gamma World and Metamorphosis Alpha that simulated after the bomb sort of things. But if you really wanted to go into space, find aliens, explore planets, Traveler was your go-to system. And it's very, very free-form. There's not a lot of stats. There's not a lot of skills. Your character sheet can fit on an index card. It is very, very simplified. It's also notorious for having a character creation system where you can die before the character is actually created, because you go through years and years of military service, and sometimes your military service ends when you die. There are automatic Traveler character generators out there available on the internet. I highly recommend them because it's nothing more frustrating than making up a cool character, having 16 years of skills and military service, and then you die. The other thing about Traveler is your characters start much older because they've generally served in the military and have applicable skills. So it's not uncommon to see characters in their mid-30s to mid-40s just starting out on their adventuring career. One of the other things about Traveler is the main mode it goes into is exploration, where you are going out and exploring new planets and finding new planets and encountering new worlds, new civilizations, new aliens, all of that. The other major factor is basically running your own business and maintaining your own ship. There's a lot of rules for that, and there's rules for spaceship combat and repairing your ship afterwards and everything else. Traveler is a very broad game, and you can explore it over and over again. And it does have a set setting in the Imperium, but you can take the Traveler system and apply it to any big sci-fi universe you want. So if you want to do universe creation on your own for world building, Traveler is an excellent system because it is so broad and doesn't have that many constraining rules and constraining things in their setting where you have to follow it. People have played Traveler for many years and still continue to play Traveler because it is a solid system. And that's one reason I wanted to make sure to mention it under the science fiction settings, is sometimes it can be a popular game that is played lots locally. One of the difficulties in all these different games is it's very easy to find Dungeons & Dragons games. It is more difficult to find Dungeon World or Dungeon Crawl Classics or Traveler games because they are kind of niche. But I want to let you know about them. That way, if perhaps in the future you can maybe run your own after hearing about it, or maybe take a look into it and get a group together and say, here, DM, have this great, awesome book. Okay, your turn to run, and things like that. That's going to kind of do it for Traveler and the sci-fi settings. There are many others. There's a Star Trek game, one of many, just like Star Wars has been through many incarnations. And sci-fi is a big, broad category. And we have dystopian we're going to try to talk about at the end. And it's kind of an extension of science fiction, but it's different enough and has enough games that are dystopian that we went ahead and separated it out. A lot of these games we put role-playing tags on. It's a very brief list and non-comprehensive of things that allow you to look at the game and quickly go, okay, that's a science fiction game. That has a lot of rules. But I can make up my own setting, and it has a lot of combat. So that could be one of the things that you want to look at is the download. And when we do this again in a more extended version, we will still be using these tags or some tags very similar to them. The next thing is a very popular role-playing genre with lots of great things, horror. And we're going to go with the ultimate atypical horror game, Call of Cthulhu, and Carolyn's going to talk to us about it.
Excellent. Yeah, so I didn't think I actually liked the horror genre until we did our Pelgrane Press Q&A, and I realized that I pretty much exclusively play horror genre. When I heard horror, I thought, oh, that's, blood, gore, the really blockbustery type stuff that you see in the movies. But the way that we think about horror in role-playing games is really the mystery, the build up to the moment where you are fighting the big bad. And Call of Cthulhu is one of those classic horror games. Hopefully everyone can kind of see that cover there. Is it backwards? Probably backwards. Nope.
No.
Excellent. Cool. So Call of Cthulhu is based on the works of H.P. Lovecraft. I think Cthulhu, Lovecraftian type games have been popular for a long time. My game group plays this one pretty regularly. I like that this came right after Jason talking about Traveler and the character development there, because the character development is so different in Call of Cthulhu. There are all the skills, all of them. You can do any type of skill imaginable. You can create your own skills. And it does become a little overwhelming. And it's very different than some of those more narrative-based games, or even D&D, where you have a very specific set of skills that are limited. Call of Cthulhu is all about having a wide variety of skills. The other thing about the characters in Call of Cthulhu is that they are pretty fragile. This is not meant to be a game where you are fighting the big bad. This is meant to be a game where you're trying to prevent the big bad from coming out. It's very much about the mystery and investigation. The big bads are bad. They will kill you. They will kill your character. So you're always trying to figure out ways so that you don't have to get to that big climatic end. But it's still very engaging. If you don't love doing combat all the time and you're more interested in mystery and investigation, I think this is a great option. Trying to think about any other kind of unique pieces to this game. Is anybody else on our team has done Call of Cthulhu that thinks there's something special?
I don't know so much, like I've not played it, but that's one of my significant other's favorite game, and he plays it a lot, and he's in like a group that only meets at Gen Con every year, and they keep playing it. And the way he always described it is like, you'll die, but a lot of it is trying not to go insane too. And then the hilarity that ensues when characters actually go insane, and how once characters start going insane, like how that can derail the scenario and scene and things like that. And then you're also fighting against trying to keep the big bad from coming through, but you're also like fighting against your own like friends around the table because they're insane and things like that. So I thought that was a very interesting dynamic of the group, because then you do end up playing against each other sometimes, depending on the situation.
Yeah. One of the other aspects is the luck feature, where you kind of have a pool of points that you can just pull from. So if you're really wanting to make something happen, you can use some of those luck points and burn them to help you out. However, running out of luck is not a good thing in the game either. So you have that kind of tension and balance of trying to get things done and win, but also, again, not go insane.
I also want to say there are many variations of the Cthulhu genre. Call of Cthulhu is the most popular, but there are things like Pulp Cthulhu, Trail of Cthulhu, Achtung Cthulhu, all of which are little variations on the theme, and some use different systems. One of my favorite variations is Cthulhu Dark. It is a very simple one-page role-playing system. All the rules fit on the front of one sheet of paper. That's also your character sheet at the same time. The number one rule is if you fight something, you die. There's no rolls. There's nothing else. You just die. The tiger rips your face off. Whatever it is, if you fight, you're dead. So it encourages a lot of things to run away or hide or do things to not have to face that eventuality.
I will say, if that's your thing, that's awesome. But if you are looking for the more combat heavy, Pulp Cthulhu is probably your better bet. It's a little bit more like Indiana Jones. Your characters are tougher. They can take some hits. You probably still don't want to go up against Cthulhu. But if you want to still have that combat part of your gameplay, I think Pulp Cthulhu is the best option.
I'm going to recommend Achtung Cthulhu, which is where you're playing in pre-World War II and World War II as the Allies fight against the Nazis. And the Nazis have all these occult secret societies that are trying to basically do very Cthulhu-esque things, and you are trying to fight them as part of an Majestic or Department M, either as British or American kind of investigators. But you do have combat skills that you can call on, and you do also have things like howitzers, because it's World War II, and mortars, and other things like that. Call of Cthulhu is a very broad genre. There are tons of variations. I think it's on the 7th or 8th edition of Call of Cthulhu, and they aren't as different as D&D editions are from one another. They're just variations that have come up, and it's like, okay, we're going to tweak this rule this time, and luck points are one way to do that. But the insanity system and that vast array of skills has remained consistent from all editions.
All right. Amanda, you're up next with the World of Darkness.
Woohoo. Yes, World of Darkness is like trying to stay top level and just succinct about World of Darkness feels like nearly impossible, but I will try, and I will also welcome any chiming in because I'm relatively new to the World of Darkness. But it is definitely one of those systems that leans more into the horror aspect of things. I've been to multiple games where we had to like take people aside at the beginning and be like, this story is going to get dark. Is everyone okay with these directions that we are going? Because it can go places. There's a bunch of different settings and games within World of Darkness. And the ones that I have played are Vampire, Mage, and Scion. I feel like Scion is probably the most lighthearted. It's kind of like Percy Jackson sort of feel, where you're the offspring of gods and you've got cool powers and embracing your divinity and all that kind of thing. But the other one and Werewolf, I've kind of skirted the edges of Werewolf so far. But Vampire is one of the ones that I've been a little more involved with, and it has such like a rich history of not only like the lore, but players that have established timelines that are like basically canon. If you get into the LARP scene, where you have to like educate yourself on what has gone on in each city, if you're going to join each city, and I don't even want to go into that because that's a whole nother thing, but it's pretty cool if you want to just dive into something that is really deep and rewarding, and you don't mind the darker side of games sometimes. But as far as the system, it's a D10 system as well. And in this one, unlike 7th Sea that I described, where you're adding up everything, the GM will set like a difficulty. And so whatever dice you roll that are above that number, you get to count how many successes you have. And there's a whole bunch of, I feel like I'm just pulling from so many different games at once as I'm thinking of them. But of course, with Vampire, you are struggling against your inner beast as you're playing. There's a bunch of different vampire clans that if you have, certain preferences from almost like a D&D perspective of like, well, I like to be a fighter brawler kind of thing. Okay, well, there's a clan for that. No, I'd rather be like a sneaky rogue type that's going to do subterfuge. There's magic users, essentially, and illusionists and stuff like that. And also, one of the main, like, there's definitely some interesting combat that has happened in our vampire games, but one of the main focuses that I think people who have played would agree is political. Like, it's very the clans, how they interact together, and just like trying to keep a balance of relations and all of that kind of thing. And also keeping up what is called the masquerade of, trying not to let the normal world know that vampires are a thing. I have only played Vampire the Masquerade. There are different versions, of course. Show and tell. I happen to have a Dark Ages book, even though I have not played Dark Ages yet. But yes. The other one that I have played is Mage, which the magic system completely confused my group. But I know there are others here that have had much better success. But it's just, I really like a lot of just how the system and the lore and character building and the D10 system they use is, I think, one of the most like beginner friendly kind of systems I've stumbled upon, of where it just seems to click with everyone. That's like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I roll these. That's how it works. Cool. But yes, I could go in depth even more, but I think I will cut myself off there and let anyone else with more experience chime in on World of Darkness.
The only thing I'm gonna say about World of Darkness, we were kind of chatting. I was chatting about it with Jason and Amanda before this event started. Was that my group has always been very open and allowing all of the expanded universe of games to be included in. So when we've done our World of Darkness games, they've always allowed for all of the books. So at one table we had vampires, we had mage, we had werewolf, and I think changelings. And when you mix them all together, it is very easy to break the system and break the game. And we have stolen the souls of 2 different GMs because they allowed us to have all of that together. And when you mix mage and vampire and werewolf at one table and you have all of those rule sets, things kind of descend into chaos. And we literally had a mage entire world timeline, and our GM just closed his book and was like, we can't continue because literally you broke time. So I will say that it's a lot of fun, and if you're down for chaos, it's really easy to descend into chaos in that system. But my word of advice is that if you want to get groups together, if you play it or run it, keep it to 1 or 2, either vampire and werewolf or mage and werewolf. But just know that mage and werewolf have some big, bard lifting up the rest of your fighters, and it can go chaos anyway. Mage just makes everything chaotic. So that was just my one piece of advice, is maybe not allow all of them at once at the same table.
I've had quite a lot of experience with World of Darkness over the past 3 decades. I adopted Vampire almost immediately after it came out, and it quickly became one of my favorite games. Vampire has a lot of personal horror, and that's why we put it in the horror category. We also considered putting it into the superhero category, because you basically play all these supernatural creatures with all sorts of cool powers. And you can play it very much as that sort of thing. It is horror. And the reason it's called the World of Darkness is you don't have to know anything about, hey, this is the world outside my window. We're going to set it in Cincinnati today. And we're going to play vampires. And you've just been embraced, and you know nothing about vampire society. Go, and you just start there. And you learn about the fight between your humanity and the beast. You learn about all the different politics going on. And the theme of Vampire is really that personal horror of humanity versus the beast. That's one of the key things there. And and you'll also see it in just about every edition of Vampire, including the most recent one, 5th edition, that came out 2 or 3 years ago. Werewolf is a different type of game where you're basically playing people that have lost a war and are desperately trying to hang on to what little gains they've made. It is totally different themes than Vampire. Uses a similar dice system but goes 180 degrees a different direction and has a totally different agenda and very, very different. And it's kind of cool, but you do get cool powers, and you do have the opportunity to really change the world if that's your thing. You can really get into it and make world-sweeping changes for the better, and it makes you feel like a good person. I have a lot of experience with Mage. Mage, the main theme is hubris, where, sorry, I'm reading the chat, where you have the ability to do anything as a mage. The core concept behind it is, if you could do anything in the world, what would you do? And then it becomes, what are the consequences for doing that? What comes back on me for changing the world? And sometimes does my ability to change the world become so overwhelming that I lose track of my own humanity and believe myself to be better than everybody else? And is what I'm thinking the right thing to do actually the right thing to do? And there are other versions of World of Darkness. There are Wraith, where you play basically somebody who's died. And then you play Changeling the Dreaming, where you play as half human, half phase. And there's Demon the Fallen, there's Hunter the Reckoning, where you can play different types of characters. In addition to the World of Darkness, there's the Chronicles of Darkness.
Jason, we're getting pretty close to time. I think we probably want to move on to some of the other games that we have.
Yes, we do. Let's move on to Dresden Files.
We knew this would happen. Mm-hmm. We're so passionate about all of these games. So I'll try and make Dresden a little bit quicker. So Dresden Files game is based off of the book series by Jim Butcher, the Dresden Files book series. We have it classified in horror, but it could also kind of fit in fantasy because it's wizards and fae and things like that. But it's in modern world. So it's basically, if you don't know Dresden, he is a warlock in modern Chicago and all of the chaos that can ensue from that in the book series. So the game runs off of the Fate core system. The RPG runs off of the Fate core system. And I'm not going to go too much into Fate because we are actually talking about that system later on in this. But there are 3 types of Fate. There's Fate core, there's Fate accelerated, and Fate, condensed or something like that? Yeah, Fate
condensed.
So Fate is a rule system that is open source that you can take it into any campaign or any kind of story that you want. It's out in the world for people to use, but it focuses more on storytelling. So the Fate system really gives you enough rules to be able to determine if it's possible for somebody to do something, but it still requires the players to tell the story, to explain how something happens, to explain how they know each other, to explain how this thing that they want to do and they want to run and make this jump attack would actually work, and how their skills in their backstory play into that. And then just the few rules that are in Fate then allow you to roll to see if you succeed or fail. Now, I will say that Fate system runs on specialty dice called fudge dice that have either a positive, a negative, or a blank. And it's usually a set of 4 that come with each set. So it kind of gets fun and interesting with the Fate system. Now, I know, for example, I'm just going to call Amanda out. Amanda and her group loves Dresden Files, but they don't like Fate. So you guys admitted it to another system. And that's the cool thing that I did want to point out about like a lot of the systems like Powered by the Apocalypse and Fate that we talk about. A lot of these, you can kind of take your story and your world and fit them into a system that you like better. So I'm actually not going to talk anymore about Dresden since we're talking about Fate a little bit later. So I will allow that one to move on. That's Carolyn with
the other thing I want to.
Oh, sorry.
The other thing I want to say about Fate, real quick, and Dresden Files, is an extremely well-written book. It has gotten awards for the writing. It is very comprehensive and very engaging, and there are little post-it notes on the edge, and just to pick up the book to read is interesting. But we're going to continue under Urban Shadows with Carolyn, which solves all the problems of putting vampires, mages, and werewolves together.
That's true. Yeah, and when you all were talking about World of Darkness, I was like, well, Urban Shadows has every single one of those types of characters. It is a Powered by the Apocalypse game, so as Jason was saying earlier, it uses 2d6. A 10 plus is a success. A 7 to 9 is your mixed success, and then a 6 or lower is typically some sort of failure. This is probably my favorite game. I think that the character archetypes are really interesting. This is my favorite character to play, the Oracle. As Jason was saying, with the Powered by the Apocalypse, you have playbooks. And what I really like about those is they are just one really big sheet of paper that has all of the information you could ever need about your character. And it just prints out really pretty. You can customize things, but it doesn't get overwhelming like those Call of Cthulhu games. You have only a certain amount of options, and they can be limiting, but I like having a lot of, not a lot, but like some amount of limitations, I think helps you be a little more creative about your character. A couple of the really special things about this is the way in which you make connections between other characters at your table. A session 0 is really important for this game because you're not just creating your character in a vacuum, you're creating your characters together. One of the things you do is something called debts. And you go around the table and you figure out who you owe a debt to and who owes a debt to you. And that really changes the dynamic of how those characters interact. And it creates a backstory that between those characters. And then one of the other things I really like is something called an intimacy move. And that's where because this is a more narrative-based game where you kind of describe what you're going to do and then you roll based on what the GM tells you to roll, you can have these really deep connections between characters that create some sort of intimate moment. And I'm not just talking like romantic intimacy. I'm talking like becoming friends with someone or trusting them with something very important. And you get bonus perks for doing intimacy moves. And I think that makes it much more character-driven as a narrative game than some of the other ones that we've talked about today. And just before we move on, I do have like 3 other Powered by the Apocalypse games just hanging out on my table. So you can tell that is my favorite system. And we're going to move on now to historical. And I'm actually up first for that one. I have Good Society here with me. It's probably the game that I've run the most. It is based on the works of Jane Austen. So if you're a fan of Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility or any of her other works, even if you just love the movies, this system is very flexible. You do not have to be a Jane Austen expert in order to play it. In fact, one of the best things about this system is the collaboration piece, where you discuss all sorts of things, including how historically accurate you would like to be. A very interesting thing about this game is that you do not use dice at all. There are tokens that you can use to trade between characters for doing certain things, but I'll be perfectly honest, in my games, we have not used tokens very much. The narrative is so much more important to this game than skills or anything kind of related to that. This system also comes with cards where you create relationships between characters. It comes with cards for NPCs. So instead of the GM playing all the NPCs, you actually trade NPCs with people at your table. So you get to play more than one character during the game, which is kind of fun. And all the people are kind of interesting looking. Some of them are based on real people. I just kind of like their faces. Their faces are always... Hilda is very popular. She just looks very judgmental. So it is really fun to be able to play more than one character. It also means you end up in more scenes, so you're not waiting on other people. And the other cards that they have are things called desires. And this is basically your main goal in the game. And I like this because you actually have something you're working toward rather than like leveling up skills. You're trying to accomplish something that's important to your character. That's a really, really quick run through of Good Society. And I didn't see any questions come through on the chat for that. It's also a lot of variations, including Pride and Prejudice and Practical Magics, and Sense and Sensibility and Swordplay. Let's see, what is it? Downstairs at the Abbey is coming out soon. So if you're like a Downton Abbey fan, tons of variations. With that, I'll pass it on to Jason with the hero, or with the Fate Core. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Fate Core, we included it under historical because it is such a broad system. There are many broad systems out there that can be used to emulate any different genre you want. Fate I chose as historical because you can set it anytime you want, and this power scale is the same if you're playing peasants, if you're playing nobles, if you're playing gods, if you're playing abstract beings that control the universe. It's all the same system, and it's all relative. Fate characters have three things in common, and if they don't have these three things, they are not Fate characters. One, they are skilled. That means that they actually have skills and have the ability to change the world and be applicable. Secondly, they are proactive. So they are not just waiting for the next thing to happen. They are coming to the table with their own agendas. And if you don't have a proactive character, you don't have a Fate character. The other thing about Fate is that you need a dramatic character. So a character that has some drama in their background, that is not just a flat character who wants to gain power or something like that. Your character has to have an interesting backstory or an interesting personality trait in order to get Fate. There are other games I wanted to include under here, like Savage Worlds, which is good for pulp, and GURPS, which is good for just about everything. But we don't have time to go into them. So we're going to pick up and move to superhero genres and go over a couple of the more popular games in that genre. I'm going to start with Mutants and Masterminds. Mutants and Masterminds is somewhat similar to a previous version of D&D. You play superheroes. They have a specific setting that you can put it in, but you can also put it in your real world, your own fictional setting. You can have Paradigm City, or you can play in Millennium City, wherever you want. You can play in Cincinnati. Most superhero games are conflict-centric, meaning there is probably going to be some investigation, but eventually it comes down to mano a mano with the big bad, and you have the power to go against them. And there are various systems that do this in different ways. Mutants and Masterminds allows you to build a very detailed character. So if you want a character that turns into a whirlwind, you can create that character in Mutants and Masterminds and some other systems. If you have a character that splits into multiple people with different personalities, you can create that in Mutants and Masterminds and other systems. The big thing about superhero systems is they need to have a good powers system. There are lots of superhero games out there that kind of gloss over superpowers, and that makes them okay, but if you're going to have a superhero game, you're going to want to have the cool powers. There is an exception to this, which we're going to talk about next. We're going to talk about another Powered by the Apocalypse game called Masks, and Whitney's going to chime in about that.
Yeah, so Masks it won a few awards, and my gaming group had tried to play a lot of superhero games, and we just really didn't like how they did powers and how they did, I don't even know how to explain it, like how like you could build a character so that it was like, well, I want a character that can phase and shoot that phase as like a light beam, but that wouldn't really work well with a lot of the superhero systems out there because they were very, very rigid. Like you have the power to teleport and that's it. So then we found Masks. And like I said, it's won a couple of awards, and it is a Powered by the Apocalypse game. So it runs on that rule system. So you have your playbooks and your move sheets, and it's pretty open. So with Masks, you are playing teenage superheroes. You're in high school. And if you think that sounds very young, it really isn't. Especially like with the games that I played, like we explored a lot of very adult aspects of things. So as you would expect, any teenager that has a magical power or things like that, that's a superhero, you're going to kind of get into that world. But building a character and getting up and off the ground and ready to start a game, we literally had our session 0, built our characters, and had our first encounter in one sitting. So with your playbooks, you have about 10 playbooks, and then your character sheets kind of look like this, and they kind of fold over and they look like books. So that's your playbook. So I played a bull, and then you really just kind of go through. So with your playbook, you then go through and it says your look, and then you just circle things how you want your looks to be, what you want your abilities to be, what your labels are. And your labels are really what helps you when you talk about your story when you're trying to do a move. So if, for example, I'm a bull, and one of the bull moves is in a china shop, and you directly engage a threat. That's my skill. That's my power. I can just directly engage. But to be able to tell the story and say how I engage, how I try to get into this fight, how I run to them, how I try and fight with them, all of that I tell by a story. And then I use my labels to help me. So like I have, let's say my label for savior is a +3. And I say, this person is attacking this sweet old lady. I'm going to bull rush in there and use my bull in a china shop. I get a +3 to roll because I said that I'm going in as a savior and I'm using that ability. So it's how I tell the story to build my dice pool. And it's a lot of fun. A lot of fun, like hilarity ensues because it's open. But what I love the most about this as a superhero system is that, as I said, like my special move was in a china shop or physics. What's physics? I can explain how I want to do over the top superhero abilities. And I'm not stuck to a rule of, oh, you can only like run in and punch like Hulk. You can't run in and have somebody like Iron Man spin you around really, really fast and give you extra punching power when you throw in to a fight. So with masks, you can do something like that. You can build off of the other powers in your group. You can explain things. You can do over-the-top story power abilities and superhero abilities to then play your character. So you're not limited to all you can do is phase or all you can do is teleport, which is what I've experienced a lot. And I don't like those types of limitations because I don't know about you, but every time I read a superhero story, how Cyclops or Storm or somebody actually fights and how they conclude a battle is never the same. Like it's very different and it's always evolving. So that's why I like masks, because it is very much like that. And every time you play, it's almost like you're resolving in a different comic book.
Whitney, what other media resembles masks?
Okay, so the Teen Titans, the original Teen Titans, not Teen Titans Go. And so a lot of like the comic books, the simple issues, and then like your more of like your cartoon comic TV based shows. Is that kind of what you were asking?
Yeah, Young Justice, Young Avengers, Young Justice being the big one that I kind of focus in on, because it's not about fighting villains. I mean, it is, but it's more about the relationships between the characters. And yeah, and that's the big driving thing going on in Masks, is all about the relationships going on in the team.
Yeah, like on your actual character sheet, like this whole section, which is literally the third thing you do, is you build your storyline. So it's when your team first came together, how did you come together? And the entire table has to figure out, like, how did we all meet? How did we all become our own team? In relationships within members of the group, like who's your best friend, who is the person that you compete with the most, things like that. And then those relationships also build into the story. So as in my group, we had two characters that were from rival football teams. They were the quarterbacks from rival teams, and the school got like hit by a bomb during the game, and we all kind of came together to fight the bad guy at the same time. But because they were from rival teams, even though we worked together as a superhero team, they were always trying to one-up each other. So when we were fighting in a battle, the chaos that ensued because they were always trying to outcool the other one was just ridiculous. But it was really fun because they played into that part of their character and their relationship while being teenagers in the story while getting the fight done.
Very good. I'm going to talk about Hero System with the game Champions. It's one of the original superhero games. It has gone through 6 different editions, each one changing just a little bit, trying to get a little bit more balance. It is one of the most simulationist types of games I know. They have rules for just about everything. So if you want to know how much you can lift, there's rules. If you want to push yourself to lift more, there's rules for that. If you want to turn while you're going really fast, there are rules for that. The best part about Champions is creating exactly the character you want. You can create any known superhero, your own thing that you've just come up with in your head. The power system is absolutely open and ready to go. A word of warning, it is heavily math intensive. So you may have to have a calculator or some sort of program in order to create characters. It does not have a lot of skills as a basis. It just has skills that you sometimes use, but it's very much combat centric. You're going to come into conflict and you're going to have battles on a map, and you're going to knock people back and knock people up, and you're going to run them out of endurance and all sorts of other things that are very cool superhero things. But it doesn't really lend itself to narrative play that much. You can play it that way, but it's really more of a combat-centric, tactical type of game. And I've played it somewhat, but I really believed it deserved a mention. There are other ones that came out around the same time, including Mutants and Masterminds, Villains and the Vigilantes, that have similar systems, but Hero System has really taken it all the way to the extreme as to how you build powers and build characters. And it is possible to build extremely broken characters in Champions. By putting all your points into certain things and creating, he can blow up the world from his ICU bed where he's the only person who can survive. But that's all he can do. And it's pretty broken, but sometimes that's fun. Sometimes it's fun just to come up with those broken character concepts. That's what we have on superheroes. Superheroes is another really broad category, like horror is, where there's lots of variety. There are more Powered by the Apocalypse systems that cover the superhero genre. And there are also more light systems that cover it in a more fun and casual way. We're going to go on to our last category, and it looks like we're going to have some good time for questions. Dystopian. The classic dystopian game is Cyberpunk, where human misery, squalor, oppression, overcrowding, corporations that are too powerful, the cheapness of human life, deadly combat, cybernetic arms, all these things are core to the cyberpunk experience. It's a kind of an older system. It doesn't have a lot of the modern things because it is from the 1980s, but I felt like I had to include it because it was such the archetypical dystopian game for so long before other games came along that kind of took on the same spin. Like the Sprawl and the Veil that are powered by the Apocalypse, and there are others out there as well. The Resistance, which kind of plays off of the Resistance social game. But Cyberpunk 2020 is very much classic cyberpunk fiction movies. If you want an action-oriented game, Cyberpunk is the thing, because you do outrageous amounts of things that would never happen in real life, would only happen in the movies. And that's really all I have about Cyberpunk. I've not played it extensively. I have read it extensively. But the next thing we're going to cover is a game that can almost be classified under fantasy because it has magic and elves.
Yep.
Or it can be classified under dystopian because it has human misery, squalor, and everything else that goes along the dystopian genre. So I'm going to turn it over to Whitney with some Shadowrun goodness.
Yeah, and honestly, it can also kind of fit into sci-fi just because of your cybernetics and hacking and being able to tap into that. Shadowrun is it can be so many things. So Shadowrun is a dystopian sci-fi fantasy game that is cyberpunk, but it's cyberpunk with magic and elves and orcs and shamans, and it's like you would think that there's too much in the game. Like if you add in all of these things and you think about how it works and you're like, that shouldn't work, but it does. And you don't quite understand why it does, but it does. But you can be a partially cybernetic Native American tribe shaman in this game that is fighting against a an half elf, and that has a bionic arm that has a sword attached to it. It doesn't sound like it should work, but it does, and it's a lot of fun. So Shadowrun has been around since the 80s. It was another one of those very early on cyberpunk kind of dystopian future games. The kind of scary, but the initial Shadowrun world was set in 2050. And it was this super dystopian, futuristic kind of society. Since then, they've changed it in later editions, and I think the year is supposed to be like 2089 or something like that now. Like I said, the game's been out since the 80s. There are, I think, 6 editions now. The latest one just came out in 2019. So this game is still very, very active. There is a lot of lore, but you don't actually have to know the lore to kind of jump in if you want to get into this game. Now, I have played this game quite a few times, and I will say that we've kind of had like themes to the games that I've played. We've had some more of your traditional cyberpunk dystopian games, but we've done some more of our urban fantasy, which focused more on your magical creatures, your shamans, things like that. But hacking and splicing and magic and cybernetics all kind of really comes in. But I will say the Shadowrun game is a D6 based game, and it is very rules heavy, and it is pretty crunchy. And I don't want to say it's necessarily combat heavy, but it is very like you have specific skills, you have specific abilities, and you roll you say, I want to do something. The GM says, okay, do you have the skill for that? And you build your dice pool based on that skill. It's a little less story building, definitely more rules and crunchy that way. So if you do like a more rules heavy system where things are a little less freeform and a little bit more unified, Shadowrun is a really good game for that. It is a lot of fun. I will say Shadowrun is another one of those games that is kind of easy to break. If you have players that are really good at min-maxing characters, which, as you have heard me talk about, my gaming group is fantastic at. You can give them a game and a system they've never played in, and they will find a way to cheese it and min-max it to the game-killing ability. So you do have a little bit of that in this game, but as long as you're aware that you can do some min-maxing and kind of like overpower characters in certain ways, you can build and adjust your campaign around that pretty easily, especially because it is so rules heavy. So even though they can kind of overpower themselves, you can kind of tamper that down with the rules. I will say it can get horror just because it's urban fantasy. There's a lot of crime. It's a lot of the seedy underbelly dystopian future. So you do have a little bit of those horror elements. In a couple of the games that I've played in, it's gotten pretty dark. And some of them have been pretty open and lighthearted as much as you can with a dystopian game. It is a system that is completely built by Catalyst. So it is a rule system. Shadowrun has its own rule system. It is in the books. Like I said, there are, I think, 6 editions now. For the most part, any of the editions are playable to this day, so you can go pick up any of them and play with that book. But it is its own system. It's a lot of fun. It's a good system to use if like you want to do like an organized crime, kind of like a modern PI kind of game, or a kind of like a sci-fi cybernetic version of like your 20s mob bosses. I've done a couple of games in that kind of genre. It's really good for that. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. I think. Wait. Sorry, I'm trying to read comments. I apologize. Yeah, it is a great setting. All right. With that, I feel like that's kind of it. Has anybody else, any of our other people run?
Yeah, I've played it. I haven't run it except for the Anarchy version, which is the extremely rules light version.
Yeah.
But it is extremely much a simulationist game. There are rules for everything. And the reason there are rules for everything is because people try to break the system.
Yeah.
And there are so many rules out there that try and plug those holes. That's why it's so rules intensive. But just like any system, you can customize it. So if you don't want to deal with these rules, you can kind of gloss over them. So that really comes down to group preference and GM preference.
Yeah, I will say in my experience with running and playing Shadowrun, we have a lot of we call them house rules. It's like, yeah, we don't like how the book explains that. That's how we're not going to do it. We all agree going forward. This is how we're doing it. Okay, good. Move on. So I will say Shadowrun tends to be the game that we have the most house rules on. All right. So then that takes us back to Jason with Paranoia.
Paranoia. It's the only comedy game on this list. It is very much a competitive game between players, because the goal of the players is to make sure that everybody else dies except themselves. And that's not as dire as it seems, because you actually have a character with 6 identical clones that are watching everything you do. So if your first clone gets killed, your second clone shows up, knows everything that your first clone did, and you just change the number on the end of your character sheet. It's set in a far future, dystopian, totally broken alpha complex that is run by an insane computer. And the computer has determined that everything is treason, except what it doesn't think is treason. And even then, it thinks sometimes that that's treason. If it doesn't make sense, it's not supposed to. It's wild fun, and it just goes in all sorts of directions. And the thing is you're supposed to root out commie mutant traitors. By the way, you're a commie, you're a mutant, and you're a traitor. So what you're trying to do is stay alive longer than anybody else and get everybody else in trouble. This is done in the most modern version with cell phones, by having everybody have the GM cell phone. You can start corresponding with the computer in the middle of the game and turning people in without like passing notes or anything. And you can make arguments just on text that this person should be, executed for treason. The computer likes your idea, and they say, permission granted, please fire your weapon. And the computer sometimes intrudes upon your gameplay. It's kind of like the helpful paperclip from Word. It comes along and gives you a tutorial in the middle of the worst times. So if you're in the middle of a firefight, it tells you how to disassemble your gun and expects you to do that right now. Paranoia is a lot of fun. It's been through many editions. The most recent edition is very much player-friendly. But character creation, again, is competitive because you pick what your character stat is, and then you pass it to the left. And so then you pick your worst character stat, and you pass it to the right. So you're automatically creating tension with your other players during character creation because you're doing things to screw with them already. And it is a lot of fun. It is easy to get lost in it, in the very much the shoot 'em, shoot 'em, shoot 'em type of game, but you can also play it in a much more slow build, gather evidence, slowly turn in things to the computer to gather up what you want, and play it as a more conspiracy type game. Generally, it's fun, but it's a different type of fun. And a lot of the fun comes from the very much the free-form, fire your laser at everything that moves. And that includes yourself sometimes, because sometimes you have to execute yourself because you've determined you're a traitor. And that's Paranoia. It is wild, and I'm a big fan. And I've had a good time with it every time I've played it. We're going to cycle back to Carolyn, who's going to talk about A Quiet Year.
Okay, so I fought to keep this one on the list because I think it's so different. The Quiet Year is actually a map drawing game, which sounds like that's not a role-playing game. I think of it as like RP light. It starts out with a story that a group of folks, the folks who are at your table, have returned to a place that had been abandoned after a war, but now they can safely return. And from there, you answer questions to draw a map, and everyone at the table contributes to drawing and to creating the map. So it is really fun because you get to see your players' drawing skills. You also get to see what people think are important in a post-apocalyptic world, because one of the big things is abundance and scarcity. So like, what resources do you have in abundance, and which do you have that are scarce that you think you would actually need? So it kind of creates a tension of for the game later on when you're answering more of the questions. If something is scarce, when you answer a question, do you need to find that resource? Do you need to create that resource? The game actually has no dice, which you'll find is a theme with me. But it does use a deck of cards, which is a little different. And there are, I think, a growing number of games that are using decks of cards. Each suit for the deck represents a season, and you shuffle each of the seasons, and then you answer questions related to that season. So spring is kind of a time of renewal. So one of the questions is, you see a good omen, what is it? And you just kind of get to create the story from there. The game has a determined end. There are, I think they call them like frost hunters or something like that. The shepherds, the frost shepherds, will arrive at the end of your game. There's a card that triggers that, and that's the end. And the game doesn't really give you any information about what the frost shepherds are, but you know that they're coming throughout the entire game. And one of your goals is to prepare for that. And it's interesting because if you don't know what the actual problem is that's coming for you, how do you prepare? So you really create the story as you go along. And it is very different way of playing. If anyone has played For the Queen, the style of answering the questions reminds me a lot of that. And it could be a really good intro game to play before you go into playing the Quiet Year to get people kind of into that style of role play. Okay. That's my stuff. And I think Jason's going to wrap us up with Apocalypse World.
Yep. Looks like we are going to have time for questions, about 40 minutes or so, which is great. We can cover any system anybody has questions about. We can go back and explain things in different things. The only thing we ask is, obviously we're in a virtual setting. Be courteous. Try not to cut people off, but it's probably going to happen. I'm going to talk about Apocalypse World. This is the original Powered by the Apocalypse game, and where Powered by the Apocalypse gets its name. You are playing in basically the Mad Max setting in the future, but with psychic powers sometimes. And you can play playbooks like the Battle Babe. And the Battle Babe is someone who doesn't wear any armor but wears skimpy outfits. And she kicks butt, but just because she doesn't have muddy clothes on. And there are all sorts of, you can play gangs, you can have gang minions, you can play like the preacher in town that motivates everybody. You can create your own little society, or you can create your own little war band. There's so many things you can do with it. I have not had a chance to play this, but I have read the book. It has 2 editions. The second edition is the more evolved one, as most editions usually are. But you can download the first edition for free just by signing up on their website, and so you can see it. The other thing about a lot of the Powered by the Apocalypse games is that you can download the playbooks for free. So you can see what the character archetypes are like before you ever purchase the book. So you have kind of a preview of what's going to happen, whether it's Dungeon World or Apocalypse World or Masks. You can see what it's going to be a little bit before you make your purchase. The writing is good, as Eric just pointed out. Along with Dungeon World, it's one of my favorite books to read just for the GMing advice. It is conflict-centric, so there is a lot of conflict both between non-player characters and between player characters, but it's all done to further the story and the narrative. It is not meant to be an end of itself. It's just something that that's kind of the way it works. We have 40 minutes for questions to bring up other games you may have heard of, to maybe talk about anything in more depth. I'm going to go back through our presenters real quick to see if there's anything they want to talk about. I'm going to go alphabetical with Amanda.
Oh, looks like maybe she stepped away for a second. Oh, there she is.
I was right here. I don't think I have anything else other than to just supplement something Whitney said earlier with, we actually, when we were doing Dresden, the rules that we adapted were actually from Vampire, because there was a lot of crossover, go figure, urban fantasy, but my particular group was not cool about the freeness of the fate system with, since we just come off of playing a vampire game, we're like, but it should fit into this and I don't understand. So we actually made this huge spreadsheet of correlations, and they just needed more structure. But I'm curious to play maybe a fate system game that's either giving Dresden another try or play something else with that, because it does sound really cool.
But other than that,
All right.
I don't really have much else.
All right, Carolyn.
I wanted to build on what you said about and what a few people commented about Powered by the Apocalypse. I think picking up one of those games just for the GMing sections is worth it. It definitely gives you a different perspective on what the GM should and shouldn't be. So just as like a contrast example, when I am playing D&D, I have one person who will GM for us that like really believes his job is to make things really, really difficult for the players. He likes to cheer for the bad guys. And this is something that I found in a lot of like more combat heavy games. And maybe it is just like someone in my group, but I've seen it come up a few times. Whereas I think in the Powered by the Apocalypse systems, they talk a lot about being a fan of the players. So even if you're making things difficult for them, you're making them difficult so that their character grows and develops and has like a story to work from. It's not about, I want them to lose. It's about, I want them to have a good time making a story along with me. And I'll say Good Society is another really good book to pick up for the collaboration piece, to think about how you do a session 0, how you incorporate your players into making decisions about how you want to play the game. I found both Powered by the Apocalypse and the Good Society system to be great for being a fan of the players and getting them engaged and involved.
Okay. I go next. It looks like by alphabet. I have like 5 or 6 core games that are my sweet spot between a crunchy game and a chewy game with not enough rules. An example of a chewy game would be Fate Core, where you've got a lot of freedom to interpret the rules and you can more or less bullshit the GM into doing things that you may not be able to do in other games. So it's a little bit too loose for me, whereas something like Shadowrun for me is too structured. There are too many rules there. So my sweet spot games, I love the World of Darkness games. That storyteller system works very well. I love Dungeon World. Dungeon World is extremely flexible. It is the archetypical Powered by the Apocalypse game. It's the one I first encountered, and it holds a special place in my heart. Star Wars D6, I just like its elegance, and I like its attitude towards the entire Star Wars universe. There's a superhero game called Marvel TSR Superheroes, and that it's a very good system. It's just, it's so beer and pretzels. You can just play it after a day at school or a day at work and blow off steam and have fun with it. And it can be serious, it can be world building, it can be fighting bad guys. And it has everything, and it all ties into a very, very simple system. My other one is D&D 5th edition. And the reason I like it is the advantage and disadvantage mechanic. It's pretty much a current theme for me, is that I like a game that has one thing that you can permutate into anything you want. And those 5 games are ones that I can make my own just based on my personal preferences. Whitney.
Give me 1 second. Sorry, I was dropping links into chat.
Yeah, I know. I
saw. In a lot of what I play and what I enjoy depends on kind of who's running it with my gaming group. So aside from when I go to cons, I've been playing with the same group for over 10 years. We've had a couple people come in and jump out, but we're really in tune with each other's personality. So I do have the GM that is super, super rules heavy, that can Canon only will go by the rules, and Canon will only go by the story that he had outlined, and there's no deviating from that path. But we know that when he runs, and we tend to use the crunchier systems when he plays or when he GMs. Then we have another one of our players, when he GMs, he likes the more middle ground. So more of like your fantasy flight games that are a little bit rules and dice heavy, but still leave a lot for cinematic value. And he's very focused on, well, that's going to break this whole thing I was going to do, but it sounds cool as hell. So I'm going to let you guys do it, and I will figure out how to work it in and get the story going. So when he runs, our games are more like that, and we tend to use those systems that are mid-range. And then when I run, I like more story-driven, so I actually like running like the Fate systems a little bit more, because I center around more of, I want the players to kind of tell the story, and I hate looking up rules. I'm terrible at remembering rules. I don't care if I've played Pathfinder for 10 years, I will never remember the rule. I have to look it up every single time. I have to write down the formulas for what I need to roll for an attack, even though I roll the attack 20 times a week. It's just how I am. So with my brain, I like running the games that are more open. But because my group is like that, I experience all of those. So like, that's why I love all of these, and I kind of like and I have experience with like the super, super crunchy, rule heavy, you cannot deviate much from the path, like Shadowrun, versus more of like the Dresden that's more open on Fate. There was one game that, if you guys will allow, I wanted to talk about that we did have to cut off the list, and it's going to be really quick, and that is the new Fantasy Flight Legends of the Five Rings. I'm not going to talk much about it, but it is sort of a feudal Japanese fantasy magic world with samurai. It is amazing. Fantasy Flight has the license now. They've put out a new system. They have, just like Fantasy Flight's Star Wars game, there's custom dice for it. I have played the Fantasy Flight L5R for the last 2 years, but before that I've played why is my brain sideways? Who had the license before? AEG, thank you.
AEG.
Yeah. I played that L5R for many, many years. And what I do want to point out is, like, some of these games that we've mentioned, there are either LARPs or LCGs that kind of go with the stories as well. So like the Good Society, I believe, has a LARP for it. So you can either do your tabletop RPG or LARP it. Dresden Files has the RPG and it has the LARP, as there's a LARP for Dresden. And then L5R has the living card game that was super, super cool. And I don't know if that was carried over with, I think that was carried over with Fantasy Flight from AEG, but the AEG's living card game was gorgeous. And the artwork in L5R is hands down some of the most gorgeous artwork I have ever seen in my life. All right, that was kind of it.
So there was a question in the chat about tarot card based games.
Yeah.
And I realized that I totally forgot to mention Weave, which is something that I have actually run a few times, and I will talk really briefly on it because it's sort of an RP light kind of game as well, but it comes with these beautiful cards, and they are all it's an app that you would download on your phone, and it's a mobile based game, and the way that it works is the story settings are all free in the app. You just have to have one person who purchases the game card set and the special dice that come with it, but D6s you can use to convert. But it's very it's completely random. Like character creation, you have no idea going into it. You pick which setting. Like there's one that's sort of a D&D goblins and monsters and elves setting. There's one that's like anime. There's one that's superheroes, and people are writing more of them, and they're actually opening it up so you could write your own story system now, and you just have to map certain elements to each card. So that's something I want to do in the future. But character creation, basically, you have the tarot deck set up, and you do like you draw certain cards, and you let your phone read it, and it'll give you like 5 options or something to be like, here's backstories you could choose from for this character that you're building. And the way it just sort of organically comes together is usually very hilarious and or really badass, or and that's also how the gameplay works, is you have sort of a loose story in mind that as your players are building their characters, you're like, okay, well, this is a setting, these are the people involved, let's figure out like a few key vague plot points, but then say you need a villain, so you would scan a card and it'll give you a few options for like, here are some characters you could use. Or someone finds a treasure chest and you can scan it and be like, here's an item that was in the treasure chest. So it's very on the fly, coming up with crazy things. And it also lets you could either do just a one shot, or it lets you continue like episodically, and it saves it all in the app, and everyone has the app on their phone and they can track their character sheet. So at first everyone's like super on their phone and paying attention to their phone, and then it slowly just morphs to where you're not even looking at it anymore unless you have to do like a quick draw. But yes, Weave is very cool, and I want to play more of it, and they're working on updates right now that supposedly will make it even more customizable. But yes, Weave.
Great. A lot of these games we try to play at the Cincinnati Adventurers Guild. I'm a big fan of independent role-playing games, and I'm also a fan of getting games off your shelf and onto the table at least once. And that means that we may not all understand what the rules are, but we're going to figure them out together as we play. And I try to offer a variety of games, and there are quite a number of games going on at the Cincinnati Adventurers Guild when we meet in person that fill and use a lot of these systems. And we do have some online games sporadically, but most of them are full, although there is one coming up by Gabe, which does use, I believe, Fate Core. But we will take questions.
And you can unmute yourself to ask questions.
Yeah. If not, I'm going to throw one out just because I think it'll be fun to talk about. And that is, are there any good ways that you are playing digitally right now for some of these games?
Mm.
I'm asking the hard question.
Oh, and Travis is actually asking a similar question. I think would be good to answer. If any of these are games are playable remotely. So I can start. I am running Good Society just using Google Meet. And when you buy the game, it comes with digital assets that you can use. And I really, really love the form that they created. So I'm actually going to pull it up so you guys can see it, because it is really, really cool. And you'll get a peek at the game that I'm playing right now. So I'll share my screen. Do this one. So can everyone see that?
It's loading. There it is.
Okay, cool. So I think I flipped to some of these pages in my book, but this is all customizable here. So if I click on drama, this actually changes. in that that tab next to it, which is really cool. And then you can see like how we pick some of our magic and things, because we're playing the Pride and Prejudice and Practical Magics. And then characters, there's some other automated pieces here. One of the nice things is you can put the front of your desire card in and the back of your desire card in the back. You got your connections down here. It also has your table of magics and when you use a token or don't use a token. Also the influence of the factions for the different magical factions. If you change your influence, if you go down or up a certain amount, then you actually change what you're able to do. So they put like a ton of resources into building this this whole system online play document. I'll stop sharing that now. And it's very different than like the Roll20s of the world. Wanted to share that.
Yeah. So my group uses Roll20 for our 2 Fantasy Flight games. So my L5R game is run by one GM, and then our Star Wars game is run by the other, and we play every Wednesday and we rotate the games, but both of them are on Roll20. For those of you who don't have experience with Roll20, once you learn it, it's awesome and it's cool, but there is a very long and somewhat arduous lead up time to learning Roll20 as a DM and as a player. So for your more crunchy games, you might need something more like Roll20, because those are kind of harder to play. In my experience though, with like my group, like our Fate World or our more storytelling games, we can play those pretty easily over Google Meets, or my gaming group has our own Discord server that we set up and we just do the Discord video. And we just kind of just sit here and we roll our dice just as if we were at the table. So for your more open-ended games where it's not as rule heavy, it tends to go easier on meets and things like that. Other than Roll20, I don't know of too many other online systems built for gaming. Jason, do you have any?
I've been using Roll20 with either Skype or Discord for voice and video. I don't like the voice and video built into Roll20. It's not very reliable, and it's sometimes glitchy. I've run Powered by the Apocalypse game, D&D, White Wolf Storyteller, and what else? And I'm also playing in a Fate Core game. So it is very flexible through all the systems, and there is pretty good support for game systems that are out there. Pathfinder, Dungeons and Dragons, things like that. There are lots of online resources. I will agree with Whitney. There's a very steep learning curve. I estimated somewhere between 10 and 12 hours you have to mess around with it until you feel kind of comfortable with what you're doing. And I have helped different people try to kind of troubleshoot things and show people things. And I am available if people want to do that. I am not working. I can't work from home, and I am terminally bored. So I am available.
Yeah, the other thing I'm going to point out about Roll20 is that both of my DMs had to buy mods for the fantasy flights. So there was a cost involved for that as well. And yeah, we don't use Roll20 for voice or video. Just don't even try it. Sorry, I'm also
other questions. I saw someone was asking about some specific games up above.
That was maybe Eric.
Warhammer Fantasy Zweihander? Stars Without Number. I have not actually heard of those games. Oh, Warhammer I have, but I thought that's a mini game, right?
Yeah, but they have the RPG version.
Okay.
Yeah, and they also have an RPG for Warhammer 40K that is coming out with a new edition in print, but they've released the PDF. I have heard of Wehander. I have not played it, but I had a friend who ran it and really liked it. It has an amazing background that you can use, and it's just kind of cool the way everything works. I'm not familiar with Stars Without Number. I don't know what system it runs under. And I'm not familiar with Warhammer Fantasy except previous editions. I've messed with some of the previous editions.
Yeah, the only other games that I'm trying to remember like what were some of the other ones we had experience with. But does anybody else have any other questions? Godlike Shadows of Asterin is really good. So is Numenera. Anytime I see Shadows of Asterin, I think Numenera. And what is the Odin? Shadows of Odin? I'll remember what that one is. Have you actually played Shadows of Asterin? We have like all of the books.
Yes.
We've never been able to play it.
Yeah, I've actually played Shadows of Asterin a few times. I own the books too. They're hard to get a hold of because they're a French company and they release their books when they're totally out of copies. Then they have to republish it in Kickstarter. Yeah, I've played it a number of times. We're actually in a campaign right now. Shadows of Asterin is, for those who aren't familiar, it's a horror type game. Tends to be kind of low-key, gothic horror by and large, very story driven. You literally need just one D10 to play. It's pretty easy to play. The only thing about the books, the rule books, is you could tell they tried very hard to edit to English speaking audiences, but occasionally there will be linguistic moments where you're not exactly sure what they're trying to say. Usually it's fine. But yeah, the organization of the books can be challenging when you're trying to build your characters. But once you get into the story, it's like you hardly look at the books at all because you're all feeding off each other's stories. It's fun. But yeah, I don't know. I really hope that Gen Con will still happen, but I don't know. One of our friends, the guy who's actually running our game, Daniel Hughes is his name. He's going to be running a number of Shadows of Asterin games at Gen Con. So if you have a chance, if hopefully, God willing, this happens, please do join. He's a good GM. The guys who are from that company are also very kind, so please stop by their booth whenever you get a chance.
Yeah. I was going to mention Shadows of Asterin. It is hard to get the books, but they are always at Gen Con, and they have an amazing booth. And the game designers and artists are always there. And they're usually always at the booth. So like you can pick up the books and then they're super awesome. And any of your questions they're there and answering. We get caught at their booth for hours at a time. But they also like sign everything too.
Yeah, they do that. And I also noticed that they have miniatures that are really well made. Everything they do, they have literally just not only the gaming books, they have music that goes with it. They have miniatures. They're very into art and expression and creating the world of Asterin for you. It's very immersive.
Yeah, they're very big with immersive, and their art is some of the most beautiful art out there for books. Yeah. It's crazy. So, sorry, I was trying to go through some of these other lists. Stars Without Numbers is a sci-fi D20 game. Oh.
It looks like Jason and Amanda have experience with inspectors.
Yes. I played in like a really short one shot, and it was definitely like a more fun, casual, like lots of room for comedy, sort of a ghost hunting game. I don't remember the system at all, but yeah, it was pretty cool.
Was this the one run at the Rook?
Yes.
Yeah, that was me. Yeah, that was me.
I'm like just connecting the dots. I was like, oh, what? I think that was just, yeah, me and my boyfriend came out to that.
Yep. Inspectors is a good light system. I like it. It's lighthearted. We had a lot of fun with it, just being silly. But it was very plot driven and very interesting. It was great for the one shot. So I recommend it.
I would also recommend checking out Bubble Gumshoe for like the mystery element of a Scooby-Doo type game. It's a teen detective story game, so that seems like it would fit really well with what you're trying to do. I have actually not read this book yet. It's been on my shelf for too long, and I really want to read it and run a game because I could definitely see some like Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, Scooby-Doo type fun going on there. Other questions?
Do we want to talk about Monster of the Week?
Sure, I have that right here. So Monster of the Week is, it could also be a good Scooby-Doo type story. You'd really have to lighten it up a little bit. So it is a Powered by the Apocalypse game. Both Urban Shadows and Monster of the Week were featured on the Adventure Zone, which is getting some thumbs up there with Travis McElroy. Awesome dude. They did this really fun scenario where they were like in this home. They're all from West Virginia, so like somewhere in West Virginia. They had this great arc. It's very similar to Urban Shadows. I think the biggest difference here is that you are all trying to fight a specific monster each week, you know, so like it's like your Buffys or your Supernaturals, you know, especially the early seasons of all of those, because they are, you know, every week there's a new monster, right? So that's where it gets its title. You know, you're fighting a different type of monster. The book is pretty great because it does give you information on how to create your own monsters, how to create your mysteries. I actually get Urban Shadows rules and Monster of the Week rules mixed up a lot because they have a lot of crossover. So you could probably like pick and choose different things that you like from each one and plug them in. Anybody else have experience with Monster of the Week?
Yeah, I'm actually playing it right now, as I mentioned in the chat, and tying with our previous discussion on playing things online. I can share my screen and share what we've been doing.
Sure, yeah.
So let's see, a Chrome tab, Character Keeper. So this is our Monster of the Week setup.
Cool.
But yeah, so like we have our names, characters, our classes, appearances, our stats, moves. All of them have a note where we add the instructions on that, history, all that jazz. It's pretty simple. I think our GM copies and pastes it from somewhere because we sometimes find some weird artifacts from like other apocalypse games, but in general it works pretty well. And I know we were talking about Scooby-Doo, and there's actually a playbook called The Meddling Kid, which is what I'm playing right here. My backstory is that technically as a meddling kid, you can play as a dog. It's very clearly based on Scooby-Doo, but I'm playing a dog named Scout, whose human is a kid named Butter 2006, who speaks to the party through a GoPro recording device tied around her neck. And there's a lot of shenanigans. I think we met Slender Man as our first monster, and it's a lot of fun. Although it is, it definitely can get a little weird depending on your GM, considering that we met Slender Man possibly twice. But yeah, so it's a fun game.
Yeah, I think the other cool thing is the big magic section, which I don't feel it was used enough in the Adventure Zone, but it is something that I'm really interested in exploring more. where you have to like pull together resources or do a ritual or something. I think that they handle magic in a really interesting way in Monster of the Week.
Yeah, unfortunately, we've only pulled it once with our Flake character, but our GM told all of us that we could each take an additional weird type-based move. So of course, I, as the dog, took past lives, and I'm gonna do sort of a dog's journey, whatever that TV series was, movie was. It's I wish we could use it more, but it's we're only like a couple story arcs in.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions?
Somebody had mentioned Teenagers from Outer Space. I own it. I have not played it. It's another comedy type game. I have found that it adapts really, really easily to Fate Accelerated. Like literally all you have to do is switch the names of the categories and you have Teenagers from Outer Space in Fate Accelerated with about 10 minutes worth of work. The premise behind the game is aliens come. They've never had teen culture, and they get enamored with modern teen culture. And so they think that everything human is the bomb. They just think everything about us is special. And that kind of balances out their special powers to fly and teleport and other things, because you have the power as a human to just lie all you want and get them to realistically believe you. And that can be a lot of fun. I've done some playing of, I tried to run Teenagers from Outer Space, but I didn't have the right type of group. It's a great group for people who know each other. And you've got all sorts of people who, how do I put this, know each other's foibles and know role-playing history, and you can riff off of past games. So that's my experience with teenagers.
Whitney did post like a way to get in contact with us afterwards. So if you have more questions later, I think we have time for like maybe one or two more questions. There's a lot of stuff also that you can find on like Kickstarter. I also find that like, so we do a lot of games at Woodburn Games, a lot of programming there. I find that my local game store can always make great recommendations for me, because they'll start, like that person will start to learn about what I like. So every time I walk in, Michael's like, hey, I just got a new indie RPG you should check out. So definitely there are some really great ways to find other games that maybe you haven't thought of that match some of the things that we talked about today that interested you.
I think another thing is game stores are happy and pleased to special order for you. Yes, they're available sometimes on Indie Press Revolution or Drive-Thru RPG or Amazon. Support your friendly local gaming store, especially now when they're having a hard time, as are many other businesses. I mean, this could be the end of a lot of game stores because they are run so much by the skin of their teeth for love of the game rather than for profit of running a business.
So maybe we could, sorry, my dogs are crazy. Maybe we could wrap it up by having each of our hosts talk about one game they're excited to try that they haven't tried yet. Alphabetical order again if Amanda wants to go first.
Sure. I've actually been like writing as I've listening to all of you. But I think the one that is most tempting is Masks, because I'm typically not a big fan of superhero RPGs, but the way you described it sounds like it fixed the issues I've had with other ones of like just not having flexibility or, being able to do powers the way you want them or being restricted to only one sort of solution. So I am excited to play Masks, and I'm going to look into that. So thanks.
All right. I'm responding to someone in the chat. I picked this up at UConn. It's called Primetime Adventures, a game of television drama. And as you can imagine, it's another one of those games that doesn't use dice that I'm so fond of. It does use cards, and it's just a different way of thinking about role playing, where you are not necessarily your character, but you are creating a character that acts things out on the show. And so it's like a collaborative TV show. And I would really love to play it and run it and just see how it turns out. Jason, you're
Okay. I've got one. This is Spire. The City Must Fall. You play a dark elf in a mile-high city metropolis that's somewhat steampunkish, and you're playing elves that want to take down the high elves that have taken over the city about 200 years ago. And there's all sorts of magic and all sorts of divine things, and the characters are just out there. And I love the system, and I want to give it a try, and it's brand new, and I have not yet finished reading it. But there's a couple other people, there's one other person I've seen in the area who has the book, and as soon as I get through with the book and have an idea, this is coming to the table at the Adventurers Guild once we have a table.
All right. This is the game that I am reading and trying to learn right now. I can't see my face. I can't see where my thing is. There we go. It's Ryutama. It is a more storytelling game, and it's described as Miyazaki's Oregon Trail. And it's very artistically like, I'm throwing things. That's the card to download the, it's like very artistically like manga style, and you are traveling, and the GM is actually its own character that helps the party from afar. So you actually build your own character as a GM. And it's really interesting. And they said that like battles are kind of reminiscent to Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. So I'm like very hardcore into reading this and then trying to run it for my group. So that's what I'm learning right now. This is my big excitement.
all right. Well, we're just down to 3:30. So unless there are any other questions, I think this is a good time to wrap up.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Like Carolyn said, I dropped in some links for you to find CAG, for you to find superheroines. You can message the superheroines page and reach Carolyn and myself. You can message the Cincinnati Adventurers Guild and get Jason. A couple of you, I said that I would look into some things for you. So I dropped my personal Facebook page in there, which you can also find me through Superheroines. Amanda dropped her Facebook in there. So yeah, if you have any other questions, if you want to chat about games, just reach out to us. And yeah, thank you for joining us. Jason, do you have anything to say?
Thank you very much for joining us. I hope that you've downloaded the selection of role-playing games and terms and definitions. This is the intro version of something we hope to do in more depth in the future, where we want to go over many more games in more depth and answer questions and give examples and pass out character sheets, hopefully once we're all together again.